It all went to hell at 2:13 p.m. on a Tuesday. One moment I was watching the glorious hypnotic dance of fluorescent markers migrating across a gel electrophoresis plate. The soft blue light of the transilluminator bathed my face. The low hum of the lab's HVAC system was a soothing mantra, and the world was a place of beautiful, predictable order. I was in the zone. On the screen to my left, a DNA sequencer was diligently transcribing the genetic secrets of a sample for a patient with a suspected rare mitochondrial disease. For a scientist like me, this was bliss. This was my symphony. The next moment, the symphony conductor had a massive, catastrophic stroke. The world vanished into absolute blackness. The hum died. The blue light evaporated. The screen went dark. For one beautiful, silent half-second, there was only the void. Then, chaos erupted in a cacophony of shrieking electronic terror. The uninterruptible power supply for my server rack let out a piercing, continuous scream, a digital cry of agony. From the corner of the lab, the ultra-low temperature freezers joined the chorus, their alarms a series of frantic, high-pitched beeps that sounded like a flock of terrified robotic birds. Red emergency lights flickered on, casting the sterile white room in a hellish, pulsating glow. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the screeching alarms. My first thought wasn't a squirrel on a transformer or a citywide grid failure. My brain, a highly trained instrument of logic and deduction, bypassed all rational explanations and landed on the one inevitable, beige-clad source of all my problems. Brenda. "Chloe!" I yelled, my voice tight. Across the lab, a shadow moved. Chloe, my brilliant, unflappable, and perpetually under-amused lab assistant, was already at the main console, her face illuminated by the dying glow of the UPS monitor. "UPS battery is at 92%, she shouted over the din. "Servers have 5 minutes tops. The -80 freezers are holding for now, but the internal temp is already starting to tick up. Sequencers are hard down. We lost the whole run." My stomach plummeted. That run wasn't just data, it was a week's worth of prep work and $1,000 in reagents, to say nothing of the sample itself, which was irreplaceable. But that was a problem for later. The bigger problem was the $500,000 worth of patient samples, research materials, and custom antibodies stored in those 2 shrieking freezers. Some of them needed to be kept at a steady -80 degrees Celsius, not -79, not -75. If they thawed, years of work and dozens of patient diagnoses would turn into useless, expensive slush. "I'm going," I said, already moving. I burst through the back door of the lab and into the oppressive humidity of a Florida afternoon. And there, sitting on a pristine concrete slab like a monument to my own foresight, was my salvation. My glorious diesel-powered 20-kilowatt generator. My insurance policy against pure evil. I'd had it installed last month after the HOA's first official notice of concern regarding my lab's energy consumption. My lawyer called it a necessary operational expense. I called it the Brenda Buster 5000. My hand shook as I fumbled with the keys to the control panel. The metallic tang of adrenaline was sharp in my mouth. I unlocked the panel, flipped the master switch, and jammed the start button with the desperate prayer of a non-believer. The engine coughed once, a sickly, guttural sound that made my blood run cold. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," I muttered, staring at the inert hunk of metal. I hit the button again, another pathetic sputter. It was like trying to start a lawnmower that had been sitting in a shed since the Reagan administration. Behind me, the alarms continued their frantic symphony of doom. I could practically feel the temperature of the freezers creeping up, 1/10 of a degree at a time. "Come on, you magnificent beast," I pleaded. giving the side of the generator a firm, encouraging smack. The universal gesture for please, for the love of God, work. I hit the start button a third time. The engine sputtered, caught, and then erupted to life with a deafening, earth-shaking roar. It was the sound of a dragon gargling gravel, of a heavy metal concert being held inside a jet engine. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. A plume of black smoke belched from the exhaust before settling into a steady, rumbling rhythm. I sprinted back inside, my ears ringing. The emergency lights were still strobing, the alarms still screaming. I wrenched open the main electrical panel and grabbed the heavy-duty transfer switch. With a grunt, I threw the lever from grid to generator. The effect was instantaneous. The hellish red strobing vanished, replaced by the clean, steady fluorescent light of the lab. The server rack's piercing scream cut off mid-shriek. The freezer alarms went silent. The hum of the HVAC kicked back in. On the main console, the freezer temperatures, which had crept up to a terrifying -78.2 degrees Celsius, began to slowly tick back down. Total time from blackout to restoration, 1 minute and 58 seconds. I leaned against the wall, chest heaving, sweat beading on my forehead. I felt like an action hero, albeit one who probably smelled faintly of diesel exhaust and desperation. Chloe gave me a slow, appreciative nod from across the room. "Nice," she said, her voice the epitome of calm. I took a moment to savor the victory. The deep, throbbing hum of the generator was a reassuring heartbeat, a promise of stability in a world gone mad. My lab was safe. My work was safe. Then, I got angry. I strode through the lab, past the humming freezers and the rebooting computers, and pushed open the front door. I needed to see. I needed confirmation, and there she was, the architect of my almost disaster. Brenda Butterfield, president of the Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association, stood on the public sidewalk just beyond my property line. She was a portrait of suburban tyranny, clad in her unofficial uniform of crisp beige capri pants, a pastel pink polo shirt, and a white tennis visor that sat perched on her perfectly coiffed helmet of blonde hair. In her right hand, she held a pair of large red-handled bolt cutters. She wasn't even trying to hide it. Next to her, the main power meter box for my building was hanging open, its metal door swinging gently in the breeze. The main breaker lever, a thick black handle that took significant force to move, was yanked down into the off position. And below it, the thick, braided copper wire of the main power feed had been crudely, brutally snipped. Brenda looked up at me, a vision of unshakable self-righteousness. She didn't look guilty. She looked proud. "Your facility," she began, her voice dripping with condescension as if the word itself tasted foul, "was creating a significant and unauthorized power drain on the community grid. Several residents reported flickering lights. I took preventative measures as per HOA Bylaw 7, subsection C, regarding unauthorized commercial utility strain." I stared at her, at the bolt cutters, at the severed cable. My brain, which just minutes ago had been a frantic mess of panic, was now operating with a cold, crystalline clarity. "Brenda," I said, my voice dangerously calm, "let's get a few things straight. 1, this building has its own commercial power feed. It's not tied to your community grid. 2, Bylaw 7, subsection C, refers to holiday light displays, not state-licensed medical infrastructure. And 3, I let a small, humorless smile touch my lips. You just cut the power to a registered medical diagnostic laboratory. With a pair of bolt cutters you probably bought at Home Depot. That's not a bylaw violation. That's about 4 different felonies, starting with willful destruction of property and reckless endangerment." I gestured with my head back toward the lab, from which the low, powerful rumble of the generator was now emanating, a constant, throbbing reminder of my victory. "And, as you can so clearly hear," I continued, "the community grid and its alleged flickering lights are no longer a concern of mine. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have diseases to diagnose and a call to make to the sheriff's department. Have a lovely afternoon." I turned to go back inside, but her voice stopped me. That machine!" she sputtered, her composure finally cracking. The generator's roar was an affront to her entire worldview. "It's horrendously loud. It's spewing fumes. That is a clear violation of Bylaw 12, the nuisance clause. I will not have this industrial noise in our peaceful community." I turned back slowly and gave her a look that I hoped conveyed the vast, bottomless depth of my contempt. I knew, in that instant, that this was just the beginning. The generator had solved the technical problem, but it had created a social one. Brenda had lost the battle of the electrons, but she had just declared a new war. A war of noise, of fumes, of bylaws and picket signs. A war of attrition. And I, a humble scientist who just wanted to be left alone, was going to have to become a general. My path to this suburban battlefield had been paved with good intentions and a surprisingly affordable commercial real estate listing. For 10 years, I'd been a cog in the giant, soul-crushing machine of a major pharmaceutical company. I was good at my job, running diagnostics, developing new assays, but I was tired. Tired of the bureaucracy, the endless meetings about synergy, the fact that my research was dictated more by shareholder value than by scientific curiosity. My dream was simple: to have my own independent lab. A small, agile place focused on the tough cases, the diagnostic puzzles that bigger labs couldn't be bothered with. I wanted to be the guy doctors called when they were stumped, so I cashed out my 401k, took out a loan that made me physically nauseous, and started looking for a place. I found it on the edge of Alexandria, a former dentist's office. It was a standalone building on its own plot, but it was nestled right up against the entrance to a sprawling, immaculate subdivision called Maple Creek Estates. The zoning was a weird, grandfathered-in, mixed-use designation, a relic from before the area became a sea of identical beige houses. To me, it was perfect. The plumbing and electrical were already robust. It had a reception area and enough small rooms to convert into a clean room, a main lab, and an office. The price was a steal. I saw a state-of-the-art diagnostic facility. I was about to discover that my new neighbors saw a blight. My first inkling of trouble came 3 days after I moved in my first piece of equipment. It was an official-looking letter, thick cream-colored cardstock, left taped to my front door. It was from the Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association Architectural Review Committee. My sign, a modest and professionally made brushed aluminum plaque that simply read, "Priority Care Diagnostics," was, according to the letter, not in harmony with the natural wood tone and earth tone aesthetic of the community entrance. It went on for 10 pages, citing bylaws and subsections, and suggesting I replace it with something in either sanded pine or treated cedar. I, a fool, thought it was a joke. I called the number at the bottom of the letter. "Maple Creek HOA, this is Brenda." The voice was crisp, efficient, and utterly devoid of warmth. I explained who I was and that I'd received her letter. "Yes, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice tightening at the mention of my name. "We are so glad you received it. We trust you will be in compliance by the end of the week to avoid any penalties." "Penalties? For my sign?" "Miss Butterfield, with all due respect, my property isn't technically part of your HOA. I'm adjacent to it." A beat of cold silence. "We are all part of a community, Mr. Thorne, and the community has standards. Your glaring metal sign is the first thing people see when they drive into our neighborhood. It's an eyesore." I tried reason. I explained that as a medical facility I needed clear, professional signage. I politely declined to replace my aluminum sign with a folksy block of wood better suited for a rustic bed and breakfast. That was my first mistake. It marked me not as a neighbor, but as an adversary. The skirmishes began soon after. There was the van incident. I had a plain white cargo van for picking up supplies. One afternoon I found a bright orange violation sticker slapped on the driver's side window, the kind with adhesive so strong it takes a chisel and a bottle of industrial solvent to remove. The violation? Parking of a commercial vehicle in a visually sensitive zone. I wasn't even on their property. I was in my own designated parking spot. When I called Brenda, she informed me that the visual sensitivity of the zone extended to any area visible from the Maple Creek Estate's main thoroughfare. I had to start parking 3 blocks away and hauling equipment by hand. Then came the HVAC incident. My lab requires a specialized high-volume air conditioning and filtration system to maintain a sterile environment. It runs 24/7. It produces a low, constant hum. A week after it was installed, another cream-colored envelope arrived. This time it was a formal complaint, co-signed by 3 of my new neighbors, about the incessant and disturbing industrial drone that was, and I quote, disrupting the migratory patterns of the native songbird population. I was fairly certain the local songbirds were more disturbed by the neighborhood's army of domestic cats, but I was beginning to learn that logic had no place here. The final straw, before the great blackout, was the trash can incident. I received a $50 fine in the mail. My crime? On trash day, I had placed my large recycling bin 6 inches too close to the curb. According to the photographic evidence Brenda had so thoughtfully included, my bin was a full 1.5 feet from the curb, while Bylaw 19F clearly stipulated a minimum distance of 2 feet to ensure aesthetic uniformity and prevent obstruction of street-sweeping vehicles. I paid the fine. But it was then I realized I was dealing with a special kind of zealot. This wasn't about rules. This was about control. My lab, with its humming machines, its white van, and its metal sign, was a defiant island of function in Brenda's pristine sea of form. It was different, and to Brenda Butterfield, different was dangerous. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that she would not stop until she had driven me out. That's when I bought the generator. The rumble of the generator was still shaking the floor when the sheriff's cruiser pulled up. Brenda, who had been pacing on the sidewalk like a caged leopard, ran to it as if it were the cavalry arriving at a besieged fort. 2 officers got out. One was older, with a deeply lined face, a gut that strained the buttons of his uniform, and an air of profound weariness that suggested he'd seen every form of human stupidity and was no longer capable of being surprised. The other was young, lean, with a fresh-out-of-the-academy haircut and an earnest expression. He had his notepad out before his feet even hit the pavement. I mentally dubbed them Miller and Davis. Brenda launched into a performance worthy of a daytime soap opera. Her voice quivered, her hand went to her chest. She was a concerned citizen, a protector of the innocent, a lone voice of reason against the encroaching industrial menace. "Oh, thank goodness you're here, officers," she cried, gesturing dramatically towards my lab. "This man, he has some kind of factory in there, and this machine." She pointed at the source of the rumbling. "It's deafening. I'm sure it's spewing toxic fumes. The children, think of the children, they can't even play in their yards with this racket." Davis, the rookie, was scribbling furiously in his notepad. "Toxic fumes, loud noise." Miller, the veteran, just looked from Brenda to my lab, then to the severed power cable, his expression unreadable. He ambled over to me. "What's going on here, sir?" "Good afternoon, officer," I said calmly. "I'm Alex Thorne. I own this facility, Priority Care Diagnostics. I decided to skip the part where I accused the dramatic woman of multiple felonies. For now. About 20 minutes ago, we lost power. As you can see, I pointed to the snipped wire. It appears to have been deliberately cut. Miller's eyes flickered to the bolt cutters still lying on the grass near Brenda's feet. She seemed to realize her mistake and subtly kicked them under a nearby bush. Seeing as we're a medical lab with temperature-sensitive materials, we have a backup generator, I continued, my voice even. That's the noise you're hearing. It's our emergency power. He's lying, Brenda interjected. It's not an emergency. He runs it all the time. He's a public nuisance. I ignored her and looked at Miller. Would you like to see my business license and state certifications, officer? You can come inside. I'll show you exactly what we do here. Miller nodded slowly. Davis, stay with the complainant. I led Miller into the lab. The steady hum of the equipment seemed to reassure him. The place was spotless, all white surfaces and gleaming stainless steel. Chloe was back at her station, looking a picture of professional competence. I walked him to my office, pulled out a thick binder, and laid it on the desk. Here's our business license, State Health Board certification, our CLIA waiver, and the commercial zoning permit for this property, filed with the city in 2023. Miller picked up the zoning permit, his eyes scanning the document. And what exactly is in those freezers that's so important? He asked, his voice a low rumble. Officer, imagine the power goes out at the main hospital. They have massive generators, right? For the operating rooms, the ICU. I'm a smaller, more specialized version of that. In that freezer, I pointed, we have tissue samples from cancer patients waiting for biopsy results. In the other one, we have blood samples for prenatal genetic screening. If they thaw, the results are compromised. A patient's treatment could be delayed, or a family could get an inaccurate result. It's not just money, it's people's lives. Miller was quiet for a long moment, just looking at the documents. He walked back to the front door and stood there, listening to the roar of the generator. It is loud, he said finally. It is, I agreed. It's an industrial generator, not a pool pump. But it's also the only thing keeping me in business right now, thanks to that woman out there. He walked outside, with me following. Davis was still listening patiently to Brenda's ever-expanding list of grievances, which now apparently included my lab's potential effect on local property values. Miller held up a hand, silencing her. Ma'am, he's a licensed medical facility operating in a commercially zoned building. He has a right to be here. Brenda's jaw dropped. But the noise, the bylaws. HOA bylaws aren't criminal statutes, Miller said, his patience wearing thin. Now, as for this, he gestured to the savaged power box. This is vandalism and destruction of property. We can't prove who did it without a witness or a confession, so my hands are tied. But I'd advise whoever did it not to do it again. He gave Brenda a long, hard stare. He turned to me. Sir, she might have a point about the noise. City has ordinances about decibel levels. My meter's on the fritz, so I can't test it today, but you might want to look into that. Try to be good neighbors. He sounded like a weary father telling two toddlers to share a toy. I'm trying, officer, I said truthfully. Believe me, I'm trying. With a final warning to keep the peace, Miller and Davis got back in their cruiser and drove away, leaving me and Brenda standing in the rumbling afternoon air. She glared at me, her eyes narrowed to slits. She had lost, but I knew she was already searching for a new angle of attack. Miller had given it to her. The noise ordinance. I had won the battle. She was already planning the next campaign, and I knew, as I watched her march back toward her beige kingdom, that I needed to call in reinforcements. The next morning, the generator was still humming its song of defiance when a dusty, beat-up Ford F-250 pulled into my parking lot. The logo on the side read, Gus's Contracting and Creative Solutions. Below that, in smaller letters, no job too weird. A man who could only be Gus swung himself out of the driver's seat. He was big, built like a retired linebacker, with a magnificent graying beard that looked like it had its own ecosystem. He wore a coffee-stained work shirt, faded jeans, and an aura of supreme, unshakable competence. He took one look at my lab, one look at the rumbling generator, and then stared for a long moment at the immaculate cookie-cutter houses of Maple Creek Estates. "Ah," he said, his voice a gravelly baritone. "An HOA job. That'll be an extra 20%. "I haven't even told you what I need yet," I said. "Don't have to," he grunted, walking towards the generator. "Got one of them." He jerked his thumb towards Brenda's domain. "Breathing down your neck. Seen this movie 100 times. The villain always wears beige or pastel. So, what's her beef today? The noise? The noise, the fumes, my sign, my van, the migratory patterns of songbirds, and the general disruption of her suburban tranquility." Gus chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound that almost harmonized with the generator. "Classic. Let me see the beast." I walked him around the generator, which was sitting on its concrete slab looking naked and industrial. Gus circled it like a wolf examining a sheep, occasionally kicking a tire or patting its metal housing. "She's a beauty," he said. "Good power, reliable diesel. But subtle, she ain't. So what's the plan? You need me to move it? Put up a fence?" "I need a permanent solution, Gus," I said, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over me. "I can't live tethered to this thing, waiting for her to find a cop with a working decibel meter. I need to be able to run my business without a daily declaration of war. I need a fortress." Gus's eyes lit up. A slow grin spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "A fortress," he repeated, savoring the word. "Son, you don't need a fence. You need a masterpiece of malicious compliance." He started pacing, his mind clearly at work. "We're not just going to hide it. We're going to build you a custom sound-dampening enclosure, state-of-the-art acoustic foam on the inside, solid core construction. It'll bring the noise down to a gentle purr, but the outside? Oh, the outside is where we have our fun." He stopped and pointed at the HOA's main entrance sign, a monument of routered cedar and river rock. "She likes that folksy, rustic crap, right?" "She lives for it," I confirmed. "Perfect," Gus said. "So we'll use materials that are specifically allowed in their bylaws. I'll bet you a steak dinner their rule book has a clause about eco-friendly recycled materials and artistic embellishments. We're going to build you a structure out of recycled plastic lumber in a hideous shade of teal, some corrugated metal for that modern farmhouse look she probably loves, and top it off with, say, a bafflingly placed stained glass window of a geometric goat." I stared at him. "A geometric goat?" "Artistic embellishment, my boy," Gus said with a wink. "It'll be 100% code compliant. It'll meet every single one of her stupid rules. But it will be so aesthetically jarring to a woman like Brenda, so offensive to her beige sensibilities, that she'll have a conniption fit just looking at it. We will build something so perfectly, technically legal, that it will drive her insane. We will build you the fortress of science." For the first time in weeks, I felt a genuine surge of hope, of glorious, vindictive joy. I had found my general. I had found an artist who spoke my language, the beautiful, lyrical language of weaponized technicalities. "Gus," I said, extending a hand, "you're hired." The work began 2 days later. Gus's crew was a motley collection of characters who all seemed to share his quiet amusement at the project. They descended on my property with excavators and concrete mixers, the organized chaos a stark contrast to the rigid order of the neighborhood next door. And just as Gus predicted, Brenda was there, every day. She'd stand on the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, a sentinel of suburban propriety. She took pictures with her phone. She brought out a tape measure and checked the setbacks from the property line. She was a hawk, waiting for a single misstep. But Gus was a master. Each time Brenda marched over with a new complaint, he was ready. "That footing is too close to the easement," she'd declare. Gus would calmly produce a copy of the city-filed plot plan, showing they were a good 2 feet inside the line. "All good here, ma'am." "That material!" she shrieked one day, pointing at the stack of teal-colored recycled plastic lumber. "That is not an approved color." Gus would pull out a dog-eared copy of the HOA bylaws he now carried with him at all times. According to bylaw 23G, approved exterior colors include all shades found in nature. I'd argue this is a lovely tropical lagoon blue, very natural. You got a problem with lagoons? My favorite was when they installed the stained glass window. It was a masterpiece of abstract horror. A goat's head made of jagged shards of orange and purple glass. Brenda just stood there, her mouth agape, utterly speechless. She couldn't find a rule against it. It was art. It was an embellishment. And it was hideous. The fortress of science was rising. The war was about to enter a new, far more creative phase. With the fortress of science under construction, a strange sort of calm descended. The generator was still running, but the promise of its eventual silence seemed to have placated the immediate threat. Brenda, however, was not one to remain idle. If she couldn't win on the noise front just yet, she would open new theaters of war. The period of petty escalation had begun. Her first move was psychological. One morning, I arrived to find that a series of large, professionally printed signs had been installed on the community-owned grass strip bordering my property. They were aimed directly at my front door, a barrage of passive aggression. "Enhanced security in this area," one read. "Report all suspicious activity." Another, my personal favorite, simply said, "This is a quiet neighborhood." It was a clear, targeted message. I stewed on it for a day, and then I called Gus. "She's put up signs," I said. "It's like living next to a very judgmental, poorly designed airport." "Let me think on it," he said. The next afternoon, a truck from a high-end landscaping and irrigation company pulled up. Within an hour, they had installed a series of new, high-tech sprinkler heads along my side of the property line. They were motion-activated. The next time Brenda came to stand on the grass strip for her daily inspection of Gus's work, a powerful jet of water suddenly erupted from the ground, drenching her from her beige capris to her sensible orthopedic shoes. She shrieked and scurried back to the sidewalk. When she confronted me later, sputtering about deliberate assault, I just shrugged. "It's a smart irrigation system, Brenda," I explained with a straight face. "It's designed to conserve water. It only waters when it detects movement, to scare away deer and other large pests. I had no idea it would be so effective." She knew I was lying. I knew she was lying. We had reached a new level of unspoken combat. Brenda's counter-move was biological. She declared my lab a source of potential industrial allergens at an emergency HOA board meeting. A week later, the HOA landscaping committee, which consisted of Brenda and 2 other women who looked like her clones, descended on the property line. They planted a dense 6-foot-high wall of Bradford pear trees. If you're not familiar with the Bradford pear, it's a popular landscaping tree because it grows fast and has pretty white flowers in the spring. It is also, and I cannot stress this enough, infamous for the fact that its flowers emit a stench that is charitably described as rotting fish. She was building a literal stink wall between us. I let them finish their work. I even waved. Then I went back to my office and spent an hour on the city and state environmental resources websites. As it turned out, the Bradford pear, Pyrus caleriana, was officially listed as a Tier 1 invasive species in our state, known for aggressively crowding out native flora. The next day, I filed a formal, anonymous environmental complaint with the city's Code Enforcement Office. 2 weeks later, an official city vehicle pulled up. A man in a uniform got out and, after a brief, heated conversation with Brenda, slapped a notice on one of the trees. The HOA was being ordered by the city to remove the invasive species at its own expense. The look on her face when she read the notice was a treasure I will cherish for the rest of my days. The war was escalating. She had tried psychological and biological warfare. Now she moved on to propaganda. She organized a picket line. It wasn't a big one, just her and 3 of her most loyal Brenda Etes, as Chloe had started calling them. They would stand on the public sidewalk for an hour every afternoon, right around when parents were picking up their kids from the nearby elementary school. They held professionally printed signs with slogans like "Families over Factories" and "No experiments on our block." It was infuriating. It was embarrassing. People were starting to stare. "We have to do something," Chloe said, watching them from the front window. "They're making us look like a supervillain's lair." "What can we do?" I said. "It's their right to protest." "So, let's fight PR with PR," she said. "Let's show them we're not evil scientists. We're part of the community." And so, the Priority Care Community Health and Science Fair was born. The following Saturday, we set up 2 folding tables in our front parking lot. We bought 3 dozen donuts and a giant thermos of coffee. I brought out a blood pressure cuff and offered free, informal blood pressure screenings. Chloe, who was fantastic with kids, set up a microscope with a few harmless pre-prepared slides: onion cells, a maple leaf, a fly's wing. She let the neighborhood kids look through the eyepiece and explained what they were seeing. It was a stunning success. A few people stopped out of curiosity. Then more came when they saw the free donuts. I took a dozen blood pressure readings and gently advised 2 people to follow up with their doctors. The kids were mesmerized by the microscope. We were friendly. We were normal. We were giving out free food. Across the street, Brenda's picket line looked increasingly absurd. Her small band of protesters stood there holding their angry signs, while a happy crowd of their own neighbors mingled on my property, laughing and drinking coffee. After about 30 minutes of being utterly ignored, they quietly rolled up their signs and dispersed. We had won the hearts and minds of the people, one glazed donut at a time. I thought, foolishly, that this might be the end of it, that she might finally accept defeat. I had underestimated her tenacity. I had underestimated her capacity for rage. She had lost every battle so far. Now she was preparing to go nuclear. The final phase of the war began not with a bang, but with a quiet knock on my lab's back door late one evening. I opened it to find Mr. Henderson, a retired accountant who lived 3 houses down from Brenda. He was a quiet, mild-mannered man who had served on the HOA board for years before Brenda had staged what he called a coup and ousted him. He was holding a thick, 3-ring binder. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice low, "I think you'll want to see this." He pushed the binder into my hands. It was heavy. "She's a tyrant," he said, his eyes hard. "She's called a special session of the annual meeting for next week. The only agenda item is you. She's trying to get the board to levy a massive fine against your property and hire a law firm to sue you out of existence. This might help. End her." And then he was gone, melting back into the suburban twilight. I took the binder inside. Chloe and I cleared a space on one of the lab benches. It felt like we were about to perform an autopsy. The binder was a treasure trove, an archive of Brenda's reign. Years of HOA meeting minutes, detailed financial statements, internal emails printed out and filed in chronological order. We ordered 2 large pizzas and a case of soda and got to work. For hours, we pored over the documents, the scent of pepperoni mingling with the sterile smell of the lab. It was a deep dive into the mind of a petty dictator. We saw motions to regulate the shade of mailbox flags, furious debates over the acceptable height of garden gnomes, and a truly astonishing number of complaints about improperly sorted recycling. "This is insane," Chloe said around 1 a.m., wiping pizza grease from her chin. "This woman has dedicated more time to complaining about lawn ornaments than I have to my entire PhD dissertation." "Keep looking," I said, feeling a surge of adrenaline. There has to be something here. And then, around 2:30 a.m., Chloe found it. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Alex, look at this." She slid a document across the bench. It was an invoice from a company called Exquisite Landscapes, Inc. for $5,000. The description was vague. Common area beautification near drainage culvert, #3. The date was from last spring. "So?" I said. "They cleaned up a ditch." No, look at the line items," she said, her finger tracing the text. "Soil amendment with premium peat moss, installation of 24 hybrid tea rose bushes, application of systemic fungicide." "Alex, you don't plant hybrid tea roses in a drainage ditch." My heart started to beat faster. I pulled out my laptop and brought up Google Maps. I found Maple Creek Estates and zoomed in. Drainage culvert #3 was exactly what it sounded like, a concrete-lined muddy trench at the far end of the subdivision, covered in weeds. Then, I typed in Brenda Butterfield's address. The satellite view was crystal clear. Her house, on a prime corner lot, featured a magnificent, sprawling rose garden in the backyard. It was a riot of color, perfectly manicured, a showpiece. I remembered seeing her accept the Community Garden of the Year award at last year's annual picnic. I pulled up the HOA's budget report from the same quarter. There it was. A $5,000 expenditure for common area maintenance. She did it, I breathed. The witch actually did it. She had used HOA funds to pay for her own personal, prize-winning garden, disguising it as a vague public works project. We had her. It was the smoking gun. It was the silver bullet. It was the holy grail of HOA malfeasance. The war was no longer about defense. It was no longer about sprinkler systems or building enclosures. I looked at the invoice, then at Chloe, a wide, predatory grin spreading across my face. "Chloe," I said, "cancel my appointments for next week. We have a presentation to prepare." The annual HOA meeting was held in the Maple Creek Community Center, a soulless, multi-purpose room that smelled faintly of stale coffee and quiet desperation. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sickly yellow pallor on the 24 residents scattered among the folding chairs. At the front of the room, behind a long folding table, sat Brenda and her board, a tribunal of beige. Brenda was in her element. She commanded the room with the iron-fisted authority of a Banana Republic dictator, her gavel striking the table with sharp, definitive cracks. She moved through the agenda, minutes from the last meeting, the treasurer's report, with ruthless efficiency. Gus and his entire crew were there, sitting in the back row, having shown up for what Gus called moral and comedic support. Then she arrived at the main event. "New business," she announced, her voice resonating with theatrical gravity. "Item 1, a special assessment and legal action regarding the commercial property at 1280 Maple Creek Drive." That was me. She stood up and launched into a speech that was a masterwork of fear-mongering. She spoke of the industrial blight at their very doorstep. She mentioned the deafening noise, the unknown chemicals, the constant stream of strangers coming and going. She painted me as a corporate ghoul, a heartless entity destroying their peaceful way of life for profit. She proposed a $10,000 fine for my numerous and ongoing violations, and a formal vote to empower the board to hire a law firm to have my business declared a public nuisance and shut down for good. When she finished, the room was silent, the air thick with tension. A few of her loyalists nodded grimly. Others just looked uncertain, worried. "Does the owner of the property wish to speak?" Brenda asked, her voice dripping with false magnanimity. "I do," I said, standing up. I felt surprisingly calm. I walked to the front of the room with my laptop, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. I connected it to the projector. "Thank you, Madam President and members of the board, for the opportunity to address these concerns." My first slide clicked on. It was a beautiful, professionally rendered architectural drawing of the now completed fortress of science. It looked quirky, modern, and utterly harmless, like a fancy garden shed. "First," I began, my voice steady, "I'd like to address the noise complaint. With the completion of our generator's sound dampening enclosure, a structure built with HOA-approved materials and fully compliant with all city codes, the issue is now resolved." My next slide showed a video from my phone, a decibel meter held next to the enclosure. The reading was 52 decibels. As you can see, the sound is now quieter than a standard home air conditioning unit. I believe this fully resolves the nuisance issue. I saw a few people in the audience nod. Brenda's lips tightened. "Now," I continued, changing slides, "I am a man of science. I believe in rules, data, and the uniform application of standards. So, in the spirit of community and fairness, I wanted to take this opportunity to clarify a few small discrepancies I found while reviewing our community's bylaws." The next slide showed a side-by-side comparison. On the left, a screenshot of the HOA bylaw strictly forbidding non-native invasive plant species. On the right, a beautiful high-resolution photo of Brenda's prize-winning German irises. "A lovely flower," I noted, "but native to Europe, not Florida." Click. The next slide showed the bylaw on fence height, which stipulated a maximum of 6 feet. Next to it was a photo I had taken that morning, showing a tape measure hooked over Brenda's back fence. It clearly read 6 feet 2 inches. There were murmurs in the crowd. Brenda's face was turning from pink to a dangerous shade of red. "But these are minor things," I said, my voice gentle. "Clerical oversights, I'm sure. Which brings me to my final point, fiscal responsibility." I clicked to the final slide. On the left was the scanned invoice from Exquisite Landscapes, Inc. for $5,000 for the Common Area Beautification near Drainage Culvert #3. On the right was the Google Maps satellite image. I had helpfully circled the muddy ditch of Culvert #3 in red, and Brenda's magnificent, sprawling rose garden in green. I zoomed in on the invoice's line items. Hybrid tea roses, premium peat moss. The room went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. "I'm not an accountant," I said softly, turning to face the stunned residents. "I'm just a scientist, but I do work with data. And the data here seems to indicate that the HOA paid $5,000 for our president's personal landscaping to be redone. I'm sure," I looked directly at Brenda, whose face was now a mask of pure, white-hot fury, "that it's just a simple clerical error that can be easily explained." The silence broke. It was Mr. Henderson who stood up first. "I move for a full, independent audit of the HOA's finances for the last 5 years. He shouted. Someone else yelled, "I second that." "I move for the immediate recall of Brenda Butterfield as president," another voice called out. The room erupted. It was no longer about me or my lab. It was a full-blown peasant revolt. Brenda stood at the front, speechless, her gavel useless, as her carefully constructed kingdom crumbled around her. From the back of the room, I could see Gus and his crew trying, and failing, to suppress their laughter. Officer Miller, who was providing security for the meeting, caught my eye. He gave me a single, slow, appreciative nod. My war was over. I had won. A few weeks later, I was standing in my lab, looking at a beautiful, clean result on my computer screen. The genetic sequencing was a perfect match for a rare but treatable disorder. I emailed the encrypted report to the patient's neurologist. Somewhere, a family was about to get the answers they'd been desperately waiting for. It was a good day. The lab was quiet, peaceful. The only sound was the gentle hum of the equipment. Outside my window, the fortress of science stood as a quirky monument to my victory. It had improbably become something of a local landmark. I'd even seen a teenager taking a selfie with the geometric goat window. The back door opened, and Gus stuck his head in. He'd been doing a final walkthrough on the enclosure. "Heard the news?" he asked, a grin on his face. "What news?" "Brenda's house is on the market. Big for sale sign on the lawn. A moving truck was there this morning." I felt a strange, fleeting pang of something that might have been pity. "Wow," I said. "I almost feel sorry for her." Gus snorted. "Don't. People like that are a renewable resource. They're like weeds. You pull one up, another one just sprouts in the next town over. The new HOA president, that Henderson fella, he sent my company a thank you card. Said we'd greatly improved the aesthetic of the neighborhood entrance." We both laughed at that. He tipped his hat and left, off to fight some other weird battle for some other desperate client. I poured myself a cup of coffee and walked to the front window of the lab, looking out at the peaceful, beige and taupe houses of Maple Creek Estates. A new family was already looking at Brenda's house with a real estate agent. They had 2 young kids who were chasing each other on the perfectly manicured lawn. I took a sip of my coffee. I never wanted a war. I was a scientist. I solved puzzles contained in petri dishes and test tubes, not in the baffling social codes of suburbia. But I'd been dragged into one, and I'd learned a valuable lesson. The most complex, unpredictable, and fascinating organism I'd ever studied wasn't a virus or a bacteria. It was the North American HOA president. And the most powerful weapons in the world weren't bolt cutters or generators, but data, patience, and a deep, thorough understanding of your enemy's own ridiculous rulebook. I smiled, a genuine, tired, satisfied smile. It was quiet. It was peaceful. My lab was safe. Time to get back to work. These diseases weren't going to diagnose themselves.